Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we're going to start out with Nicholas Katzenbach. Nick Katzenbach was one of the most important legal figures of the 1960s. As Deputy Attorney General to Robert Kennedy in the John F. Kennedy administration, he was central to the civil rights struggle of the 1960s, and he was involved in the desegregation of the last two state universities in the United States, the University of Mississippi and the University of Alabama. Here's CBS talking a little bit about Nicholas Katzenbach.
Former Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach died last night. Some of us remember the name from the newspapers, others from the history books. As Deputy Attorney General in 1963, he confronted Alabama's segregationist governor at the Schoolhouse Door, demanding that he obey a federal court order to admit two black students to the all-white University of Alabama.
I, George C. Wallace, as governor of the state of Alabama, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
Governor, I'm not interested in a show. I don't know what the purpose of the show is. I am interested in the orders of these courts being enforced. That is my only responsibility here.
Katzenbach was 90 years old.
Nicholas Katzenbach was born in Philadelphia. He fought in World War II, was actually a prisoner of war under the Germans. When he came out, he went to Princeton University, scored very high marks, went to Yale Law School. He taught at the University of Chicago for a while, and then he was picked by John and Robert Kennedy after John Kennedy's election in 1960 to become part of the Kennedy administration under Robert Kennedy in the Attorney General's office. He served as Deputy Attorney General during the Civil Rights Movement, which is the main focus of what Nick Katzenbach did. But he was also involved in the investigation of John Kennedy's assassination. He wrote a memo 3 days after Kennedy's assassination with the FBI report saying that we had to prove to the American people that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. People took that as being part of a conspiracy, but in reality it was simply an interpretation of the facts as he saw them and a demonstration of what he believed to be true based on the FBI reports that he had at the time. He was involved in the Vietnam War. When Robert Kennedy stepped down from being the Attorney General under Lyndon Baines Johnson, Nick Katzenbach was the Attorney General for a while, and ultimately he retired from public service and became a private lawyer for IBM and MCI. But his main focus, as I said before, was civil rights, and that's what we'll be talking about primarily tonight. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century in the United States largely began with the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which reversed the separate but equal doctrine of public schools that had been established in 1896. Brown versus Board of Education was one of the most important Supreme Court decisions of the 20th century, if not the most important, and Nicholas Katzenbach was one of the people in charge of enforcing that law when John Kennedy came to power in 1960. Here he talks a little bit about the consequences of enforcing Brown versus the Board of Education when he came into power with John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy in 1960. This is the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education conference honoring Robert Jackson, who was one of the Supreme Court justices who was involved in the unanimous decision of the Warren Supreme Court. We will cut when he reaches the momentous decision when James Meredith was admitted to the University of Mississippi. So here's Katzenbach talking about Brown versus Board of Education.
The most significant decision of the Supreme Court in the past century. Justice Jackson was an important member of that court who helped Chief Justice Warren achieve a unanimous decision, and the court, appreciating the strong public reaction to its decision, needed to be unanimous. I think no justice predicted or could have predicted the impact of that decision as it has evolved over the last 50 years. It was a turning point in our long history of racial prejudice. Martin Luther King and the Southern church leaders seized upon the decision to demand rights far in excess of what the court had decided. Sit-ins in restaurants and lunch counters that were segregated by custom more than law began taking place, and arrest for trespass followed. While Dr. King, like his model Gandhi, preached nonviolence to his followers, their nonviolence was almost certain to induce violence on the part of others. The resistance of the white South to integration and the determination of the blacks to gain equal treatment was leading to increased danger and more violence. The struggle for African American rights was no longer confined to judges and courthouses and the efforts of the Legal Defense Fund. When John Kennedy became president, I, along with Barrett Prettyman, joined Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department. The Legal Defense Fund was bringing some of its cases to fruition, and Martin King was demonstrating with sit-ins and marches. The Civil Rights Division was expanded greatly under Burke Marshall. The federal government could enforce the law. A few executive actions could be taken, but there were very few laws to enforce. And enforcing Brown on any scale took both time and resources. How many school districts are there to sue? One by one. Thousands, I guess. And even if we had the resources, we didn't have the time. Litigation is a painfully slow process. Legislation was needed to preserve order, and meaningful legislation was simply not obtainable. The first crisis that I remember was the Freedom Riders, well-meaning northern liberals who decided to ride an integrated bus through the Deep South. Predictably, violence occurred, and it showed the world that the federal government had limited resources when it came to protecting unpopular free speech. There was no national police force to maintain law and order, and the order which local and state authorities enforced was a one-way street with blacks and their supporters being the ones arrested. Essentially, the federal government had to choose between the army and trying to use courts to establish rights, which were then difficult to enforce. The Kennedys made extensive efforts to persuade or cajole Southern governors, who, after all, were Democrats, to obey the law, to obey Brown, but to no avail. The second crisis was Ole Miss. We joined the Legal Defense Fund suit to get James Meredith admitted to the university and tried to persuade Governor Ross Barnett to comply with the order of the Supreme Court, an order signed by a Supreme Court justice. No success.
In 1962, Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi refused to allow the first black James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. Here's a conversation he had at the height of the crisis with John Kennedy.
I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. President. I'll go up there myself.
Well, now, how long will it take you to get there?
And I'll get a microphone and tell them that you have agreed to be removed.
Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute, Governor. Now, how long is it going to take you to get up there?
About an hour.
Now, I tell you what, if you want to go up there, then you call me from up there, and then we'll decide what we're going to do before you make any speeches about it.
This man has just died.
Did he die?
Yes.
Which one? State police?
That's state police.
Yeah. Well, you see, we got to get order up there, and that's what we thought we were going to have.
President, please, why don't you, can't you give an order up there to remove me?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street, and he may step out of that building and something happened to him? I can't remove him under those conditions. Well, we've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. And then you and I'll talk about what's the best thing to do with Meredith.
Well, the person that John Kennedy got was Nicholas Katzenbach. Here is the outcome of that, and then Nicholas Katzenbach will tell a little bit of the backstory.
James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi, ending one chapter in the federal government's efforts to desegregate the university. The town of Oxford is an armed camp, following riots that accompanied the registration of the first Negro in the university's 118-year history. Much of this film record was destroyed when our cameraman, Gordon Yoder, was attacked, but he did salvage pictures of Governor Ross Barnett at the scene. The governor fought the court order long and bitterly before modifying his stand, saying Mississippi was overpowered by the federal government. President Kennedy appealed to the students and to the people of the state to comply peacefully with the law and bring the crisis to an end. Even as he talked, riots were breaking out in Oxford.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For in a government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors.
Nearly 6,000 troops patrol Oxford to maintain order, and arrests mount to more than 200 as smaller disturbances erupt the next day. Former Major General Edwin Walker, who came here from his home in Texas, is put under arrest and held in high bail on charges of inciting insurrection. He was flown to a federal prison hospital as relative calm settled on the town in the greatest crisis the South has faced since the Civil War.
Little trivia, Edwin Walker is the man that Lee Harvey Oswald shot at 6 months before he killed President Kennedy. Back to Nicholas Katzenbach.
To get Meredith admitted, we ended up having to use federal troops, as Eisenhower had in Little Rock, to quell a riot which occurred that Sunday night. That riot has been called an insurrection, I think correctly, and I was there. People were killed and wounded simply to get one black student admitted to the state university. I don't intend here to recount the history of civil rights, but merely to point out that if Brown was slow to open schoolhouse doors, it was encouraging blacks to fight the caste system, which had so long suppressed them. Other violence occurred, and we in the Justice Department felt totally frustrated. Essential to resolving the problems in our federal system was for Southern state authorities to recognize their law and order obligations and to fulfill them in a constitutionally responsible way. The only other alternative we had was the totally unsatisfactory one of troops. As violence continued and the Southern law enforcement continued to harass peaceful demonstrations with water cannons and hoses and cattle prods and nightsticks, the situation became increasingly explosive. Thanks to television, public opinion in much of the country was disgusted and angered. It was not, I think, because they supported blacks so much as because they were offended by the conduct of the sheriff's deputies and the police.
Katzenbach would be center stage a year later at the University of Alabama, where he confronted George Wallace. The confrontation was not as violent as it was in Mississippi, but it was quite dramatic.
George Wallace postured by standing in the door at the University of Alabama. President Kennedy decided to risk seeking real legislation. The demonstrations, with all the dangers they involved, would only cease if real rights could be achieved through legislation.
That was Katzenbach's experience with civil rights. The picture of him standing and confronting Governor George Wallace is quite iconic. I want to play one other tape of Nicholas Katzenbach because he was front and center in the conflict between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, which we've talked about before. When John Kennedy was assassinated, all the enmity that had built up for years between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson came to the fore, and Nicholas Katzenbach was right there. Remember, he's on Robert Kennedy's side, so take it for what it's worth.
I don't know what Bobby Kennedy thought of me. Oh, I know he liked me, and I know he respected me. And we got on very well together professionally, very little socially together. Often we go out to his, I and Lydia, my wife, would go out to his house, but it was always for a big party of one kind or another. Or I would go out there with some colleagues and we would talk about problems in the department. Bobby, when I started, I wondered, I liked him. But he was awfully young and I wondered about him. And the thing about Bobby was he was as conscious as any critic of his shortcomings, his faults, as anybody that I know. He was also the most honest person I think I've ever met. And the result of this was that he used me and others in the department, some very bright people. And we would go to Bobby with problems. He would get us together as a team. And I can recollect, I think I say it in the book, he would say, "Come on, fellas, you're all better lawyers than I am. Now tell me what you think I should do." And he was that kind of a person. I feel when Bobby was killed, this country lost a person who might have been one of our great presidents. He disliked LBJ intensely, and it was all personal.
Bobby was direct and honest. Nobody really ever accused LBJ of being direct and honest. LBJ knew how to get what he wanted, and he used all the political ideas, speech, techniques, and he was good at it to get what he wanted. And what he wanted was good. And he was a man of much more intelligence than most people gave him credit for. He didn't have a good formal education, but boy, he was bright as all get out. And just as a sort of footnote to that relationship, which continues, they didn't like each other. They had to work together politically, and they did, but it was not easy for either of them. But as a footnote to it, when near the end of Bobby's life, which we didn't know was going to end, but near the end of it, I saw him, and he said, I'm opposed to President Johnson on Vietnam, strongly opposed, but I have absolutely no criticism of what he has done in this country in the domestic program. Why did President Johnson decide to leave government? It's a good question. I think it was health. And I also think he felt he hadn't been able to solve the problem in Vietnam. Maybe somebody else could.
In the latter part of the Johnson administration, Katzenbach moved from justice to state, and he also tried to get us out of Vietnam but was unsuccessful, and that occasioned his resignation.
I was broke. I left government. I was tired too. And I felt that I'd been something of a failure in the State Department. I went over there to try to get us out of Vietnam, which was probably a very arrogant thing to think I could do. And while there were a few things that I got done in the State Department, I didn't get us out of Vietnam, and that was the most important thing of all. So I was tired. I'd gone through what little money I had, and I thought it was time for somebody fresh. I'm not thinking of Mr. Nixon, but I was thinking of somebody to come in and do my job, at least, who was fresher and had more energy than I had left.
So that was Nicholas Katzenbach, a longtime public service in the 1960s, successful in some areas, unsuccessful in others, but one of the most brilliant lawyers and one of the most brilliant chroniclers of the Kennedy-Johnson administrations. I want to briefly mention Carroll Shelby, who was an American car builder who added muscle to the American race cars and ended the domination that the Europeans had had throughout the 50s and 60s with their sports cars. Shelby's Cobra was the car that finally provided the sports car competition to the European Ferraris, Jaguars, and Maseratis. Here's a brief ESPN report on the death of Carroll Shelby.
A huge loss for the auto racing world. Legendary car designer Carroll Shelby has died at the age of 89. Doctors have not released the cause of death. Shelby is known for putting the muscle into muscle cars, the Shelby Cobra, the Mustang Shelby GT500. The Automobile Hall of Famer was also a medical marvel as one of the longest living heart transplant recipients. He received a heart in 1990. Carroll Shelby, dead at the age of 89.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close tonight with a brief tribute to Carroll Shelby and his Cobra. And the tribute comes from the Ripcords. The Ripcords were actually Bruce Johnson, who was a member of the Beach Boys when Brian Wilson left the group, and Terry Melcher, who was one of the famous LA studio producers, who was Doris Day's son. They were the ones who created the Ripcords, and their most memorable song was Hey Little Cobra from 1964. So in tribute to Carroll Shelby, here are the Ripcords with a little bit of Hey Little Cobra. Shut 'em down.
Spring little cobra, get ready to strike. Spring little cobra with all your might. Spring little cobra, getting ready to strike. Spring little cobra with all your might. Hey little cobra, don't you know you're gonna shut 'em down? Shut 'em down. Shut 'em down. Shut 'em down.